Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and what better way to start a conversation that's uplifting and enjoyable about the Bible than with complaining about things? But here we go. I loved the way rock used to be. I'm a big fan of music, all different genres, and one of the things that I particularly like about rock as a genre is that, stuff means stuff. Everything has meaning. Everything is loaded with meaning. Certain genres communicate certain things, and rock communicates what I would argue is a healthy expression of rebellion. It's a healthy pushback on dumb establishment things that get so sanctimonious and so entrenched and so unquestionable and held in such high regard and esteem that it can't be pushed back on. And when that happens, you need satire in comedy, and you need raging against the machine in rock. So you can imagine my tremendous disappointment that in the last 10 or 12 years, rock has totally fizzled. People who make rock music now make rock music that supports the establishment and don't really push back on anything that is risky or dangerous to push back on at all. So for me, the bands that still gripe about things and push back on things and ask questions, even if I don't agree with them politically, are the bands I like. Muse, for example, one of my favorite acts, because with their music, they've still got an axe to grind, and it's an axe that happens to grind against established stuff. I just think it's a voice that is needed in society, and I have missed the presence of rock in that role. But by no means is rock the first genre to occupy this role in society of pushing back on entrenched things. Music has done this in a whole lot of different forms for a really long time, including all the way back into Bible times, all the way back into Old Testament times. So you and I, my friends, have been hanging out in Matthew chapter 13, looking at the Kingdom Parable Discourse, the third of the 5 great discourses around which the book of Matthew is structured. And what we talked about yesterday is that this Kingdom Parable Discourse is bisected. The first half happens with Jesus talking in a boat to the crowds. He says some parables. Some people get some of it. Some people probably don't get some of it. And then there's this pivot point starting in verse 34 that moves us away from the boat and the crowds and into the house in Capernaum, where Jesus talks in a more narrow setting with just his disciples about some parables he's already given, and he also offers some new parables at this point. And in this little pivot point in Matthew 13, we get this gem. Verse 34, Matthew 13, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. Quote, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. And we're just about back to where the rock music comes in. This is a reference to Psalm 78, which I was going to mark. I didn't mark it. Just a second. I almost got it. Just a second. All right, there it is. Psalm 78. Now, the interesting thing about Psalm 78 is it is not written by David. It was written by a guy named Asaph. And Psalm 78 occurs in the middle of a block of psalms that are all by this Asaph fellow. Apparently, Psalm 78 is something called a maskil. I've asked a bunch of people what that means. Nobody seems to exactly know. I'm going to have to remember to ask my buddy Shane, who does the Psalms Project thing. He'll have a good take on what this is. So Psalm 78 opens with a tiny bit of Bible that isn't even a Bible verse. It's just this notice that says what type of song it is and that it's by this Asaph fellow. So what this means is that before we even look at a single verse of Psalm 78, this extra versiary cue tells us that Matthew must regard Asaph as a prophet, because in Matthew 13:35, remember the verse that kicked us here, he said, so was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. So Asaph, I guess, is a prophet. Well, did Asaph know he was a prophet? Or was he just writing some songs? And what kind of songs was he writing in particular? Well, Asaph does get a little bit of press in another part of the Bible. And you know what? I'm not going to flip over there. I'm just going to summarize it. But in 1 Chronicles 6, we get an account of King David pulling together this group of guys to be in charge of the music stuff. And I mean, effectively, to use modern terms, they're worship leaders. They organized instrumentalists and singers, and these Levites who were responsible for the music, and specifically Asaph, wrote lyrics that are regarded by other parts of the Bible as also being Bible, as being Scripture, including Matthew chapter 13, where what he wrote down is acknowledged as being prophetic from God. And we know from a little later in 1 Chronicles and from the book of Ezra that Asaph cast a very long shadow. He was apparently such an influential musician that other people imitated his style. I think they were called sons, I think, of Asaph. And so apparently they tried to carry forward the tradition of his musical style. Well, what was his musical style? Well, if we want to know that, we go back to Psalm 78, the passage that was quoted in Matthew chapter 13, and we see what we get. Here we go. O my people, hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter hidden things, things from of old. What we have heard and known, what our fathers have told us, we will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he's done. He decreed statutes for Jacob, and then it goes into the larger structure of the whole thing. I just read you the introduction there, the first 4-ish verses. So what we see there at the beginning of Psalm 78 is an introduction. It's a description of how this song is going to work. What are we doing here? Well, according to the lyrics, we're taking great ancient truths and we're packaging them up in a bit of an artful way to make some kind of point. And the point is that God is real and praiseworthy. And I'd say implicit in there is the hint that maybe people need to be reminded of the impressiveness of God, because maybe some of the recent generations in Asaph's time, it looks like, weren't remembering that. And so these songs were supposed to help. In other words, these songs were a pushback on the generational zeitgeist, the commonly accepted default mindset of most of the people who were around and making culture at the time that Asaph was writing this stuff. So, Asaph is like Muse. He's pushing back on stuff. This is real rock and roll. This is, the establishment is getting weird and screwy, and I'm going to bravely say and sing things that people might get upset about, but also the complexity with which Asaph understands the situation, much like the complexity with which a great rock band understands the situation they're pushing back on, means that they might artistically package this in such a way that some people they're going to miss it. Some folks in the audience have so not nurtured the life of the mind or an awareness of what's going on, or are so just interested in going with the flow of things, that even when someone is singing a song directly against their mindset right in front of their face, even though this individual might be singing along with all of the lyrics, they still don't get what is actually being said. Thus the reference to parables. Sometimes really good pushback on the establishment rock music kind of does work like a parable, because even though the meaning is right there in front of our faces, sometimes it just slides by and we don't catch it. I mean, think about songs from your youth or rock songs that you sang along with in college or whatever, and then it comes back up now, and you've got your adult brain and you think about it and you're like, oh, dang, that was brave, or oh, dang, that was really offensive, or whoa, I just did not understand that metaphor back then. Whoa, now I get the whole song, and suddenly your eyes are open and you have the usual suspects moment where the whole song suddenly comes into focus and you see the Matrix, and I have to think that it was not different for people back then. Asaph wrote this song that clearly has an agenda to say something's weird about how people are thinking right now, but God is truer and realer, and we need to be reminded of what these truer, realer things are, and we're going to push back on the establishment, and probably a lot of people caught it right away, and we're like, dang, this is brave, and probably a lot of people missed it on the first take and maybe caught on with it later. Whatever the case, Psalm 78 goes on to give a recounting of the early game of the history of the Hebrew people, pointing again and again to the faithfulness of God and again to the flakiness of God's chosen people. Fast forward back to Matthew 13, and we've got a pretty cool connection here. Matthew is saying Asaph was a rock star who bravely pushed back on stuff. Some people didn't even get what he was doing because their eyes were so shut and their ears were so closed. And likewise, Jesus is a rock star who is boldly pushing back on something. Asaph said it to music. Jesus is doing it with speech, but they're both artistic renderings. They're both loaded with imagery that communicate not just a quaint meaning, like a little morality tale about like try to swear less and try to be less mean. And no. Instead, these are profound pushbacks on the common assumptions of their day. Asaph profoundly and boldly pushing back through artistic language on the people of his day. Jesus profoundly and boldly pushing back on the common assumptions of the majority of people here in his day. So I've got to assume that there were a ton of people in the original audience reading Matthew's document as it initially circulates who are like, dang, I see what you did there. Asaph, that's like Rage Against the Machine. Like that's like when rock took a stand and pushed back on things. Oh yeah, everybody knows Asaph. He is a rock legend. And oh wow, yeah. When you put it that way, I see it. It's like Jesus has taken up that mantle of the bold artistic language that bravely pushes back on the establishment, even though for some it's going to go in one ear and out the other to people for whom it sticks and they get it. Hey, they might like it, they might not like it, but they are going to see this is pretty profound and this is pretty brave. I think that is roughly why Matthew is including this quick allusion to the Old Testament and fulfilled prophecy here. I don't think it's just some cheap elementary level comparison where he's like, the Old Testament had parables and Jesus has parables. Neat. I think it's much more complex than that. And if you can understand the role that rock music used to play in society, and when it's on its best days, maybe still a little bit plays in society today, then you can understand why Matthew is bringing this up, because it's a very quick way to demonstrate the bravery and importance of what Jesus is doing. And it's also a very quick way to be like, if you all liked Asaph and you don't like Jesus, what's the problem here? Quick note here, I have noticed over the last couple of days that a handful of you have gone and adjusted up your Patreon support for the program, which is so dang nice of you. And if you're just doing that to be awesome, thank you all the more. That is really, really cool. But I want to be super, super clear. This deal that we're doing where I'm sending out these little pocket field note guides for the book of Matthew, these little blank notebooks that you can write in, that is for any level. Like literally any amount of support at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast when I send these out is going to result on you being on my list of people to send it to, and we're just going to send you one. So thank you so, so much to everybody who supports the program. Thank you to everybody who doesn't. I'm just glad we get to hang out together and do this stuff. Matt, this is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.